Hello and welcome to another Cafe Imports education video. In this episode, we're going to tie all of our discussions around the machine, the seed, and taste together into what we call the profile. When heat transfers, it moves from something that is hotter to something that is cooler. This is called thermal diffusion. Therefore, if we want to cook coffee, the drum we cook it in needs to be hotter than the coffee. The variance in heat between the coffee and the drum will determine how quickly the coffee heats up. This heat in the drum, the temperature of the coffee, are all measured with thermocouples. I recommend that you have at least 2 thermocouples in your system, one that probes the bean mass as the coffee is roasting, and another that probes the exhaust as the air is just barely making its way out of the drum. Once you have the correct thermocouples placed in the correct spots in the machine, you can then begin to see how the heat is interacting with the coffee. Controlling the fuel source will generally control the rate that the coffee is taking on heat. If more heat is needed, increase the fuel levels, and less heat, decrease the fuel. A driver controls the speed of a car with the gas pedal. When the car slows, adding fuel speeds it up. When the car begins to speed too quickly, the driver takes their foot off the pedal, allowing the momentum built to then decrease, slowing the car. A roasting machine works very similarly. When making these adjustments, however, prepare for a delay. Know that the only brake in case of an emergency is perhaps a fire suppression system. With most equipment, when a fuel adjustment is made, it may take 30 seconds to even a few minutes before the measurements show the change in the way the coffee is responding. This means that a roaster needs to anticipate what changes will need to be made to the fuel, to the air, prior to that change actually needing to be made. Keep a close eye on the exhaust temperature. This gives you some insight into where the coffee is going. This reading shows more information about your machine's environment and the air that is being used as a heat delivery system. If this begins to increase rapidly, it is more than likely the case that the coffee is about to do the same thing, but in a delayed response. The exhaust temperature can act almost like an RPM gauge in the car. When the RPMs rev up, it is obvious that the car is soon going to begin to speed up. Does this mean that you should roast by only paying attention to the exhaust? Absolutely not. But by watching it and the bean temperature, you'll begin to see relationships. What you learn from this will lead you to better control and begin to build in you that all-important sense of intuition when things just kind of seem a little bit off. Okay, let's get back to our coffee that is now absorbing heat. It's not helpful to simply know what the temperature of our coffee is at any given time, but more importantly, to see how quickly the coffee is changing in temperature over time. We can put this information, as well as temperature changes in exhaust and any other thermocouple we may have installed, onto an XY axis. We can then chart these changes in temperature as time moves forward. Many roasters, as they're getting started especially, will simply do this on pen and paper. I know I sure did for a very long time. You don't necessarily need to draw this data out on the axis in order to form a curve. Simply write a chart listing temperatures at certain times, like for instance, 300 degrees at 6 minutes into the roast, and so on. When I'm charting by hand, I generally take temperature readings about every 30 seconds. I find this gives me the opportunity to engage with the coffee in between readings, while this also gives me a good amount of resolution into the data. The speed at which the coffee is absorbing energy from the machine is called the rate of rise. Many roasters will shorten this simply to ROR. For instance, if between 3 minutes and 30 seconds into the roast and 4 minutes, my temperature increases by, say, 18 degrees Fahrenheit, then I can say my ROR is 18 degrees per 30 seconds, for those of you who roast in Fahrenheit. The rate of rise will show that the seed and the machine are trying to reach a place of thermal equilibrium. The coffee will rise to meet the temperature of the machine, and the machine will give off its energy to the coffee. dropping that energy to meet the coffee's temperature. The larger variance in the hot machine's temperature to the cold coffee's temperature, the faster the coffee will heat up. This will show up on that XY axis as a steep slope or a very large ROR. The narrower the machine's temperature is to the coffee's temperature, the more slowly the coffee will heat, and so the slope on your axis will be less steep. The ROR will be fewer degrees per timestamp. Let me be clear, thermal equilibrium is not what happens when the slope of your curve changes from going down in temperature to back up. That's called the turnaround. And that's really only the probe reaching a point of equilibrium. The coffee going into the drum at the onset of a roast, which is called a charge, is at room temperature. The thermocouple is reading the temperature of the space in the drum. Then that temperature plus the room temperature coffee kind of merge, and the thermocouple's reading that. The speed at which the thermocouple moves from its initial temperature to the point where it begins to increase at the turnaround point is a good indication of how responsive that thermocouple is. That event is simply the thermal equilibrium of the probe and the coffee, not the coffee and the machine. So, how can we tell how hot the machine is if the main probe is also reading the temperature of the coffee, especially during the roast? Well, I like to look at that exhaust temperature. I think it's a good indicator of how hot a roasting machine is. If that temperature remains high, it's very likely that the coffee will begin to roast more quickly. If it begins to drop, it's likely the rate of rise will begin to slow. When starting a batch of coffee, the roasting drum may show that it is maintaining a steady high temperature, but when the cold coffee is added to the machine, that thermal energy will begin to move from the machine into the coffee. This is the reason, generally speaking, that early in the roast, most roasters will increase their fuel source to the point that it will be at its highest for that particular batch. Early in the roast, the separation in temperature between green coffee and the machine is much wider. This means that the coffee is much more able to absorb, or let's say steals energy much more easily from the drum. It's kind of like dropping a dry sponge into a puddle. The sponge will absorb that water much more quickly when it is at its driest. Cold coffee acts the same way. It's important to add fuel, which adds heat, to replace the heat absorbed by the coffee and released through the exhaust as the coffee is roasting. As heat displaces from the machine and into the coffee or out of the exhaust, eventually the machine will have no more heat to give. This is why we have to add a lot of energy and reinvest fresh heat into that system. This is also why we invest a lot more energy early in that roast. As the coffee takes on heat, we can begin to taper back on the fuel source and control the speed at which that coffee absorbs heat. A roaster should not simply record the roast, but use that information to make changes to the system in live time, such as adjustments to the fuel and air, in order to guide the rate of rise in a controlled fashion throughout the roasting process. When the curve that is being created needs to be slowed, the roaster should anticipate this change and make proper adjustments to the energy going into the system. So when that time comes, the energy is lower, leaving the coffee to absorb less, and thus raising the temperature less. Conversely, if the coffee rate of rise needs to speed up at a certain point, the roaster should anticipate this and push more energy into the system so that the energy will then be readily available at the time when the coffee needs to absorb it. As we've mentioned in the past, different machine materials will give off heat in different speeds. Some materials give heat quickly and some slowly. For a drum that gives heat quickly, we know that it will also absorb heat quickly from the fuel source. These machines in general are much more responsive, and thus heat adjustment is realized by the coffee and therefore read by thermocouples much more quickly. I like to think of the material of the machine kind of like a battery. The energy coming from the burner or heating element is absorbed by the material like energy into a battery. Some materials hold on to that energy longer and release it more slowly, and others do the opposite. You'll quickly learn what happens in your unique system by watching how quickly your coffee responds. One challenge facing these machines is that the operator needs to pay close attention to every adjustment they make and why. If an operator misses a fuel change, the coffee will respond. and it may be too late to go back and make a correction. Another challenge is that not only do different systems release energy in different ways, but different temperature probes read and interpret temperature in different ways. A thicker temperature probe that reads data more slowly may show a change in temperature or a lack thereof too late. By the time the operator sees a slowing or a speeding in the roast, it's too late to make a correction. A thin responsive probe can help make more corrections, but it also may have more noise. Materials that absorb and release energy much more slowly are the opposite. A big challenge with machines built like this is if they are too hot, there is little hope in cooling them down in time to salvage a roast. If they are not hot enough, there is little chance that the coffee will be given enough energy to maintain momentum from the beginning to the end of a roast. There will likely be a stall. What do I mean by a stall, or by a roast moving too quickly? A stall does not mean that your rate of rise is reading the same number consistently, timestamp after timestamp. The rate of rise acts much more like a miles per hour gauge. If the roast is rising 10 degrees per 30 seconds, that means that the roast is progressing along and absorbing energy at 10 degrees per 30 seconds. A stall is when the rate of rise is close to or at 0 degrees per timestamp, or worse, negative. Yes, you can actually cool coffee during a roast. This will generally lead to coffee that is fairly flat, void of character, dull, and the acidity is lifeless. Do not confuse this with a coffee that already tastes dull, whether due to how it was grown or perhaps even how old that green coffee is. I'm specifically referring to a coffee that would otherwise have been a lively roast. On the other end of the spectrum, we can have a drum that has too much energy in it, which can quickly cook the outside of the coffee and cause charring on parts of the seeds. We call this scorching. As a new roaster, avoiding these defects may be your step one to successful roasting. However, as a roaster grows in their craft, they'll begin to see that a nuance in how the rate of rise changes in particular segments of the roast will result in a particular nuance in the coffee tasting differently. The process of discovering how a plotted and controlled rate of heating creates particular attributes in the finished coffee is called profile roasting. The chart that was written during the roasting process is called the profile. I like to think about it as the treasure map that leads your next roast down the path to the same destination as the one before it. In other words, if you find a roast you love, you need to know how to repeat it. A profile should be able to lead you to the same destination in flavor time after time. So beyond temperature recorded on a profile, it's also important to include any other important information, such as fuel adjustments, like from how much to how much and when. I include air adjustments, times, temperatures for different milestones that the color may display during the roast, such as color changes from green to yellow, things like first crack. When the coffee is finished, of course, the more resolution your profile can give you into what you did to accomplish a particular roast and how the coffee responded, the more likely you'll be able to do the same roast again or know exactly what to change to make an improvement. So why not simply roast all coffees the exact same way? There are many theories as to why a certain coffee should be roasted a certain way. Different coffees will take on heat in different ways. Some coffees will raise in temperature very quickly, others very slowly. Some coffees will change color very quickly and others slowly. Every time we think we've stumbled onto a hard and fast rule, we find a coffee that is an outlier and calls our well-thought and even well-tested theories into question. My job would be easy if teaching roasting boiled down to showing you a chart and telling you, repeat this. But roasting coffee is so much more. Just like any culinary art, a recipe is alive and ever-changing. The environment that it is being cooked in, the subtleties of ingredient variants, divergent equipment, and simply different desired flavor outcomes all create a reality that cooking is complicated. Roasting is cooking. Your ingredient is the wildly diverse coffee seed and all of the potential flavors that it encapsulates. Your tool is the roasting machine with its few but powerful points of control. Your final quality assurance check is your ability to taste and know that you represented the coffee in the way that you set out to. The seed, the machine, and taste. Each one holds a deep world of exploration. Each affects the other, and each deserves our time and attention. We wish you luck as you begin to explore these concepts further, and we look forward to sharing more of our insights in the future. Thanks for your time and attention.